There you go. Hotep, and welcome to the African History Classroom. I'm Professor Hicks, coming to you today, Thursday, September 4th, in the wonderful year of our Lord 2025. No, I'm just kidding. That's what they do in the European history, say the years of our Lord. You know, being a historian, you pick up these little things. But glad to be here today. I'm a little under the weather. I caught a cold somehow. I don't remember how, but I did. And, you know, though I stay in shape and I work and I eat well, it's important to understand that as you get older, things don't work as they normally do when you're younger. Meaning things like colds and infections and stuff, they come on you, and despite how well you might be eating or taking care of yourself, they still happen. So today I'm a little under the weather, but I am here for you, and we're at the African History Classroom. Don't forget to like, share, and comment. I have yet to receive any comments yet, so I'm looking forward to that. But I do expect that to happen eventually when I do broadcast across other social networks like Facebook and the others. I'm going to be eventually broadcasting. Right now, I'm still a puppy, in training, novice, rookie. All right, so you got to crawl before you walk. So before I'm able to publish across other media outlets and platforms, I got to get this together first. So let's start. So today we're reading. I'm doing some reading today. I rarely do this with you, though I do read and comment. I'm going to do some specific reading from Dr. Ivan van Sertima's book called The African Presence in Early Europe. And I'm using this book to be an addendum or support some of the things that we're talking about the Moors. So the first thing we want to get to and say is that we need to understand that the Iberian Peninsula, later called Spain, was occupied by Africans since the 7th century BC, before the Common Era. All right. Africans had established colonies, were doing trade, settled in parts of Iberia well before Columbus and well before the Romans and well before the Greeks, if the Greeks were ever there. I'm not sure. So what we're going to do is going to read a little couple of excerpts that lend support to this argument, and then we're going to move back or move towards Roman Spain. We need to understand how the peasants in the Visigoth society at the time, run by the Visigoths, how these Visigoths peasants, how they lived. But ultimately, why are we doing this? Because our essential question leading us for the next couple of days is going to be, how can we describe pre-Islamic Spain or pre-Islamic Iberia to you guys? How do we describe it? Then we want to ask a few questions, and I want you to keep these questions in your mind. And the first one is, who were these Iberians? Yes, who were? It's important to understand this because the Moors maintained control of Spain for 800 years. The Moors invaded Spain and swiftly completed their domination of the Iberian Peninsula that would make one's head spin. How were they able to do this so quickly? And then we want to move into, what role did the Catholic bishops play in pre Islamic Spain, right? Because it's important to understand that. Why? Because it might answer the question as to why we have such a swift and complete invasion of the Iberian Peninsula by the Moors. Moreover, to maintain control of someone or something or some people over 800 years, I believe, deserves some explanation on how that happened. So, again, why was the military victory so swift and complete in the Iberian Peninsula? We want to know that, all right? It's easy to talk about in the glory and feel good stuff of Moorish history, which you see again all over the internet. But here we're going to grind down and find out why these Moors were so successful. I mean, we want to give a big compliment, and we want to be proud of that. Here's a black group of men armed in army who were able to conquer a European state. But we also want to make sure, if we're going to feel good about this, that what is the whole truth regarding that? What elements of, let's say, Iberian culture at that time allowed such a maintenance of control for such a long, long time? All right, so again, on the Moors. You see, the Moors, you can't talk about this stuff unless you really are ready to do the work on it, because the Moors is a very, very complex subject. All right, what else? Let me just throw a couple of questions. So why, we also want to talk about why did and how did and when did the Iberian Peninsula become Spain? Very important. So let's begin. And again, we're going to begin with Ivan van Sertima's the definitional problem. So Ivan speaks, he says, while studying, he found to his surprise that Spain was in continuous contact through trade with Egypt and the Libyan kings called the Shoshanks or the Shishanks. Okay, these Libyan kings, Shishanks, and the Osorkins were a dynasty that was eventually overthrown by the Nubians. Okay, and this dynasty we're talking about somewhere in the 700 BC. It's important to get this down. This proves the African presence well before Columbus, well before these geniuses began to deny our history. Okay. All right. So he goes on to say he learned from a book called Al-Makari's History of the Mohammedan Dynasties in Spain of a great drought that occurred in Spain, and that they suffered thousands of years ago, those people, from this drought. This drought lasted till about 1070 BC. Al-Makari describes it in some detail, and it appears that this catastrophe destroyed many of the first settlers, and they were followed by an African group that was banished from northern Africa and settled at a place called Cadiz in Spain. So let's establish that now. Somewhere 1070 BC, we have a group of Africans who actually were in a revolt against their king in northern Africa. The king, obviously not going to take it, expelled them from Spain. From Africa, from North Africa. So they left North Africa and they settled in Spain. All right. They even have a name of one of the kings, because we understand from Al-Makari's book, Mohammedans in Spain, we understand that they had several kings after they settled there and spread out into the eastern or innermost parts of Spain. And one of their leaders was a guy named Batricus. And Al-Makari goes on to explain that Batricus sounds like a Roman name, but he says it is not Roman. It was just the way that the Romans had to pronounce it. They spelled it Batricus. You should know that many Europeans had difficulty with African and Asian names. And that's why you find things like places called Egypt. Egypt is a Greek name. That's not belonging to us. Africa does not belong to us. And most of the name places that you find today are corruptions of an original etymology African name. And many of the Europeans, particularly the Greeks who came into Africa or into Egypt early to get knowledge and gain knowledge, had difficulty expressing these names either verbally or written. Okay? So it's important to note that. That's why we have names that are putting us out of our place. Negroes, even blacks. These names are not accurate. The accurate name for Africa, for those who might not know, is Al-Kabalan. Al-Kabalan. Okay? That is an African name. All right, let's move on. So we're still reading from Dr. Ivan van Sertima's chapter on the definitional problem in the Iberian Peninsula during 1070 BC. All right, so we got to the place where these Africans settled in Cadiz. All right. Then they began to appoint kings to rule over them. The region that they took over I believe, is the area that we now find many of the Basque people. Okay. Further proof of that Africans settled in Spain at this time is something called a cartouche. A cartouche is an Egyptian symbol shaped like an oval where the kings and pharaohs etched their names, their progeny, and sometimes some of the historical events that were important in their lives. But basically, in a cartouche, you will find the African Egyptian pharaohs' names. This cartouche is singularly found in Egypt. When I was in Egypt, we saw hundreds of cartouches where the pharaohs had inscripted their names. I'm just going to give you a quick look at one. Let me move my big fingers. All right, and let me try this a little differently. Okay, I have a light that I can shine on the subject. I think that works a little better. Now, on your, I guess that would be your left, those are images of a cartouche. One is an image that was found in Egypt, and the other was an image that was found in Spain. Yes, Spain. So this is evidence. This is evidence that Africans from Egypt, Africa, landed, settled, and ruled in Spain well before the Romans, the Greeks, and even the Moors. All right. All right, there you go. That was one settlement. Let's talk about a second settlement or invasion, and then we're going to move back and show you why this is all connected. In the second invasion of Spain by Africans occurs sometime around 700 BC. Now remember, when you're talking about ancient times, you're talking about numbers or dates descending, not ascending. They're ascending now in our current historical period, but the period I'm describing here, the numbers are descending. So we started at 1070 for the first African invasion. Now we're talking about 700 BC for the second African invasion. The period of this invasion, known in Egypt, was called the 25th dynasty. And you should know the 25th dynasty was a total African dynasty. They had such notable figures as Pianki, Shabaka, and the person we're going to talk about right now called Taharqa. Taharqa, let me go back to the reading. The second invasion of Spain by Africans occurred sometimes around 700 BC, the period of the 25th dynasty in Egypt, when the Ethiopian, because there was always a battle between Nubians, Ethiopians, and Egyptians for control of Egypt. Okay? When the Ethiopian Taharqa was a young general, but before he had taken the throne from his uncle Shabaka. So he's a young general now, and he's entering into Spain. As I discussed in my book that came before Columbus, the 25th dynasty is greatly underestimated dynasty. It was a time of cultural renaissance, even though it flowered in the shadow of war and a very grave schism within Egypt. All right, so let me stop here. Egypt has had many schisms. You have the Greek invasion, Persians, Romans, Arabs. Now, come on, folks. After so many invasions, you might get an understanding why. When you go to Egypt, you see so many different types of people that are there now. Because these are latecomers. These folks are recent. Very recent. But the Egypt from which we take our grandeur was an African Egypt. And this 25th dynasty was one of the most powerful, enduring dynasties ever to ever exist in Egypt. Taharqa was at the head of that dynasty. All right, let's talk about very quickly what Taharqa might have done. let's talk about, let me start it right here. This is the same Taharka to whom the Spanish chronicles, now these are Spanish chronicles who are writing about Taharka, refer to, that led a garrison into Spain, invaded it during this period. We have references to this in a manuscript by Florian de Ocampo in Crónica General, published in Medina del Campo in 1553. Hopefully that is not too much jargon to confuse you, okay? The name of the invading general is given as Tarraco, Tarraco. There are several spellings of his name, so don't get confused, okay? The same name. He is not only identified as the head of an Egyptian army, the reference is even more specific. It says he was later to become king of Egypt, which he did, Taharka. Taharka is even mentioned in the Bible. Yes, because Taharka went on a mission to save Jewish people. And you can look up that story. It's a wonderful story. You can look up that story in the Bible. The name, the period, the historical fact of his generalship and his later kingship in Egypt, his Ethiopian origin, the wide-ranging exploration of the Ethiopians in general, all attest to the validity of this reference. But most persuasive of all is the fact that cartouches of the Upper Egyptian kings in this period have been found in Spain. Cartouches, as I showed you, found in Spain from this period in Egypt. And let's not forget what the European historians have done to us, how they have maligned us as it relates to using ships and boats. Because they have stated historically that Africans never, ever commanded a ship. Here we go. Okay. So it is a great source. I'm going to kind of skip some of the other part because we kind of know it. The Libyan kings, they were called the Shashanks. They were from Libya. At this time, the Libyans were a mixed group of people. Not all of them looked black, but the Nubian armies from the 26th and 24th eventually destroyed the Libyans and took back over Egypt. Okay. It's a source of great wonder to me that this is so well known and accepted today, Ibn Battuta is saying, that ancient kingdoms had trade routes ranging far and wide and yet even now, many scholars find it difficult to accept the crossing and crisscrossing of peoples and cultures in very early times. Again, alluding to the historical misinformation about Africans not traveling in boats. Europe crossed the Atlantic in fairly primitive boats using lateen sails developed by the Arabs. The astrolabe refined by the Arabs with no knowledge of latitudinal or longitudinal coordinates. Yes, the Europeans didn't know anything about longitude and latitude. They used the astrolabe, which is a device that gives you a bearing on where you are so that you can navigate and get to where you want to go. And they also use lateen sails that the Arabs and the Africans were using. Where did they get that? Well, we're going to get to that later. Stay tuned. All right. So I'm going to leave that right there. I'm going to get back to our subject, but I wanted to give you some basis as to why we have Africans in Spain, but more importantly, why this is not something new, that Africans have been traveling to Spain and Europe for quite some time. For those who are interested, you should try to pick up this book, African Presence in Early Europe. It is fascinating. All right, do your fact checking for it so you can see the Dr. Ivan Van Sertima. Really wonderful book. So let's go back to who were these Iberians, okay? Because we need to talk about these people. All right, the pre-Roman Iberian. This is from 200. This is before 200 BCE. All right, so we're talking about the same time maybe that we had this flood or this disastrous, what they have, what did he call it? It wasn't a flood, but it was disastrous. Let me make sure I have that correct, that I give you guys bad information. Well, it's just called the disastrous destruction of Spain at the time. All right, so we're talking about 200 before the Common Era. All right, for those who are from school, we call it BC, before Christ, even though that doesn't not true. There's no such thing before Christ. That's garbage, and we'll tell you what that is. So I'm reading. So the Iberian eastern and southern coast spoke Iberian, a non-Indo-European language, still only partially deciphered from the scriptures. Yes, this non-Indo-European language, I believe, is an African-based language. Remember, we already talked about who was in Spain before this. So the Iberians now who are there, they spoke an Iberian language that is non-Indo-European. What does that mean? That means that you cannot connect their language with any present European language. They have no way to determine. They have not yet deciphered the language. That's why I truly believe, in my opinion, that this is an African language. Because Europeans are so stuck. And they're so, narrow in their view. They wouldn't reach out. They would not have expanded out to maybe reach to see if this language has some antecedents in African. I know it does. One of the words in this Iberian Indo-European language is called Sembe. S-E-M-B-A. S-E-M-B-E. I'm sorry. S-E-M-B-E. Sembe. That's an African word. But we don't want to digress, do we? Let's stay with this. These Iberians were called Basque. You might have heard of them if you've been to Spain, the Basque. And these Basques are very unique and different people. They don't want to share culture with the Spaniards who've been there. They are unique. They say our culture is unique, our history is unique. We never succumb to Christianity and these different things. Well, I don't want to say that totally because I don't know that for sure. But they did speak a Proto-Basque language, which I feel was an African-based language, of course with some corruptions. But they cannot decipher it. And they don't want to, by the way. You see, because giving away this information is powerful, man. Just like you see what's going on in our country now with the Trump administration, and truth, when it comes down, is just shaking this country. The truth is like worse. Dr. Ivan Van Sertima said many years ago that the truth is worse than an atomic bomb. And he is right. Because this country is about to explode based on truths that have been repressed for, well, I don't want to say centuries, but for seems to be decades. We don't go there either. All right. So the Celts in the interior and northwest spoke languages sometimes called Celt-Iberian, mixed with Iberian. I believe these Celts also have some African ancestry, because when we get to England and we get to Ireland, we see that they were populated first, unsettled first by black people, who the English population and later Irish population called them Celts. Yes, these are the Europeans of these native who were, said to be native, called these people who they didn't recognize only as dark skinned and swarthy. They called them Celts. Another group of people also could be related to the Iberian. They call them Tartessians. Now, I haven't researched the Tartessians, but I hear a lot of times on Facebook young people posting talking about Tartarians and stuff like that. I haven't researched that. I'm not really interested, and I will, but I believe they have some Phoenician Punic ancestry. And you should know that the Phoenicians and the Punics are from Carthage, and Carthage is located in North Africa. And Carthage was a multilingual, polyglot place in Africa that mostly Africans were there, but everybody crossed into Carthage. Carthage is the same place that the Romans finally destroyed after several fights with Hannibal. All right, so let's continue. Now we're going to move it down. Now we get into the juicy part. Rome and Spain, 2nd century BCE to 5th century current era. All right, so we're going to go from the 2nd century Rome, and maybe a frame of reference for you might be the time of Cleopatra, 30 BC on down to first, Cleopatra. All right, so if you ever seen the movie, you can maybe get a frame of reference. This is what we're talking about now. All right, And we're talking from the 2nd century BC. We're going to go to the 5th century current era. So this is right before the Moors invaded Spain, about 500 AD. And I only mention AD. I don't use those terms anymore, but just for the public use and for your reference, AD. Okay. All right. After Rome, this is Rome now. They're entering Spain. After Rome conquered Iberia, Latin, the name of the language that the Romans spelled, was spread quickly. So these people, after being conquered, quickly adopted the language of the Latins of the Romans. All right. By the fall of the Roman Empire, something called Vulgar, like you're being vulgar to me, Vulgar Latin had become the dominant everyday language across Hispania. Over centuries, the Vulgar Latin language evolved into what we call today the Romance languages. And that would be the Spanish that you hear people speaking today, French, Catalan, which you hear people in Spain speak, Galician, which you hear people in certain areas of Spain, and also Portuguese. Yes, Portuguese. These are considered a Romance language, all of them from the Vulgar Latin language. The Visigothic Spain. Now we're going to talk about Spain when the Romans are done. The Roman Empire has declined. It fell. It ate itself. It fed on itself. People talk about, oh, how the Roman Empire doing it. No. Listen, along with the Visigoths and the Vandals who helped decimate the Roman Empire, the Romans pretty much did this on their own by the way they treated their people, the slaves that they had, the Senate who completely oppressed the people and kept the people in dire straits all the time. This place that we hear about democracy reigning, even the Greeks, these people never, let me just say it categorically, these people never practice a democracy. You can't practice democracy and kill the people that speak philosophy. And this is what happened in Greece. It happened in Rome too. So this democracy that Western civilization says it bases itself on, from Greek, and there's just no proof. Do the research yourself. We barely have a democracy here. And though we always wanted to attain that goal, we never did. The American government is a republic. It is not a democracy yet. We've strived to be that, but we have failed at every turn, as we are now. We are a democratic republic, where we vote on our leaders for right now, but other than that, we have not attained this democracy as it. I really don't know many countries, even historically, that have attained this democracy. Okay, this is a very difficult term. Okay. All right, let's get back to our Visigoth. And remember, I'm going to whenever I dive into that rabbit hole, I'm going to bring you back to the topic. So we're in the Visigothic Spain now, 5th century to the 8th century. That's almost from the time that the Moors were there to the time they left. The Visigoths, remember, these are the people who are controlling Spain now. They are a Germanic people. Let me say that again. Most of Europe are offshoots of Germanic people. The Danes, the Swiss people from Switzerland, from the Danish areas, the German people, all of these people were German originally. So the Visigothic Spain, these Visigothic, a Germanic people, ruled much of Iberia after Rome fell. They spoke a Germanic language called Gothic at first, but that quickly faded. The ruling elite and the church used Latin. Yes, because that's what the Romans left behind. And money exchanges, administrative duties, offices that were important to the social structure of Spain used Latin as the formal language. But it was quickly also turning into what we just spoke about, and that is the Romance languages. So the ruling elite in the church used Latin, which remained the main written and spoken language for administrative law and religion and the elites. Everyday people, like us, we spoke a local dialect of Vulgar Latin, which we applied to ourselves to communicate and express what we felt in our own language mixed with the Vulgar Latin. This is what they did. All right, the Vulgar Latin, which were direct ancestors of later Spanish, Portuguese, and Catalan. So just before Islam, the early 700s, the Vulgar Latin became an early Romance dominant language in Iberia. The Basque still alive in the Pyrenees Mountains. Now, the Pyrenees Mountains, we talked about geography, now it's why it's important. The Pyrenees Mountains, we should know, separates kind of Spain from France. This is where the Basques lived. This is where they, southern Spain, this is where they kept their enclave. All right, so Gothic still now, we know Vulgar Latin, but Gothic, the original language that Visigoths brought, is still lingering among the Visigoth elites. All right. All right, so let's talk about the culture. What culture did these Islamic folks have? This is important again, because don't forget our question. We want to know about how can we describe first pre-Islamic Spain, and then we want to know who these Iberian people were. These people who were dominated so far, as I described to you, by the Romans, dominated by their own people, the Visigoths, and now we're going to talk about them being dominated by the Moors. When you ask about culture of pre-Islamic Iberia, it depends on the area that you're talking about. The peninsular Iberia was a real crossroads, and it layered as a result of it being a crossroad through people changing, migration, integration, forced through wars. This crossroads, and of course trade, became a layer. This culture began to layer itself. So you had the Iberian culture, which wasn't nothing. Then you had the Roman culture. Then the Visigoths brought their culture. So you had these layers of mixture of traditional, indigenous, Roman, Visigothic influences. Might want to see why these people are so confused, okay? All right. So the Iberians lived or settled in the east and south of Spain. This is why I believe they were so much influenced by Africans, because east and south is where Africans came from, where the Phoenicians came from, where the Punic people came from. These people also lived in fortified towns. This is another cultural continuity of Africans. We always lived in fortified shelters. Even in the Americas, the Algonquin, who were Africans, who lived in America before Columbus and before the people who call themselves indigenous now, the ones with the Ipecacual eyes, the Chinese, those were not the first people in America. The first people settled in America are Africans. We have the bones, we have the archaeology, we have it all. But you will never get this mentioned because the Indians are so busy claiming America as theirs, and with a confluence with Europeans who have tricked us and misled people through information about Indians that, we've just been lost here. All right. But, there I go down another rabbit hole. So these Iberians lived in fortified shelters. They farmed. Africans, we are the progenitor. We started agriculture, and then they did metalworking. Now, metalworking in Europe had taken place nowhere else. But the first iron was smelted in West Africa and Mali and the places where these Moors and Berbers came from. So I know, based on my research, that who we're talking about here, these early Iberians, were mixtures of Africans and possibly Europeans. By the way, when these Romans left, they left beautiful bronze art, figurines, and sculptures. But they also probably, when they got there, the Romans, they found that there, because Romans have no great history of art. Don't get me wrong, they're Roman bosses. But I believe those influences are African. So these Iberians left behind beautiful art. We have nowhere else in history where Europeans are doing beautiful art. Until now, until present. All right? They had stone figurines. These figurines are similar to what they found in the caves in France of Africans who were drawing their environment and making Venus sculptures of women with the large buttocks and the heavy breasts. And we all know what women look like that, right? We won't go there. Then they took their religion. All right, we're talking about culture of the Iberians, right? And they mixed it with their gods, the gods they were learning about, being influenced by, along with the Romans. Don't forget, the Romans were pagans as it relates to religion. There's a whole bunch of movies to show you the Romans bowing down to little gods and what's the with the Gladiator. You see the Gladiator movie, the guy. You see the guy bowing down to little gods. Yes, they picked up our religion's practices. All right, I'm going on. All right. And also, I should mention, as a side note, I don't think it's really that important, but these Iberians and Celtic, they were tribal sometimes, warrior-based societies. Remember, the Iberians, the Visigoths were a very rough, tough people. All right, they came down into Spain, all right, from Central Europe, and they were tough as well. All right, so I'm going to get past some of this. I'm going to go down to Roman Hispania. It's important to understand that while the Romans did control, when we're going back to the Romans control, 200 BC to 400, they had Latin language, they had Roman laws, they had mostly urban life, people in the cities. They had an agricultural economy. I'm just getting through this real quick so we can move on to the main stuff. They had culture, Romanization culture. This is when Rome controlled Spain now. A very short time. Romanization was deep. Hispania produced Rome, while colonizing Spain, produced some great emperors like Trajan, Hadrian, Theodosius. They had writers as well. Their religion, of course, I mentioned was Roman pagan religions, until Christianity finally spread. And don't forget, you guys seen enough books and pictures showing the Romans persecuting Christians. Now the tables are turned, and the Christian are now taking over the Romans. It shows you what an idea can do. We talked about it. He is the greatest empire in the world, being subjugated by Christians and eventually having to adopt the Christian religion for their own survival. All right, so now we got Romans as Christians. Keep it there. No longer they're pagans celebrating individual or idols. All right, they're believing one God. All right, so let's talk about the Visigoths quickly again. These are the folks that now are running Rome before the invasion of the Moors. After Rome collapsed, the Visigoths established a kingdom centered in Toledo. Remember, geography. Told you it's going to come back to you. The religion of these Visigoths was called Arian Christianity. Arian. Why? Because these people had succumbed or found appealing to them the Arian religion. And what is that? Well, Arius was a pope who attended the Nicene Conference in 320 AD. And Arius was a black man. So when you hear Arian and you think right away white supremacists, because these dummies are walking around calling themselves Arian, don't realize that this man, or this Christian pope, was African. So these Visigoths were influenced by that, and they carried this religion for their time until they became Romanized. Initially, Arian Christians converted to Catholic in 589 current era. They did this at something called the Council of Toledo, which of course was in Toledo, Spain. This coming together, ridding themselves of Arianism, these Visigoths now are unifying their country and absorbing anyone in the country into the the Catholic religion. All right, let's talk about the Visigothic culture. Latin remained the written and liturgical. Liturgical simply means the practices, the bowing, the taking the oath, baptismal. That's what liturgical language. You use certain language to express what you're doing. Okay. Early medieval art and architecture in Visigoth Spain had influence from Germanic influences along with Roman influences. Their education and writing centered in monasteries. Let me stop a minute. the Catholics and Christians refused to give the peasants and serfs and regular people any knowledge. They wanted to keep them stupid. They wanted to keep them ignorant. So what they did was, when they wanted to learn, you had to become a bishop or something like that, where you would be placed in a monastery and you would then decipher the Bible. You weren't really allowed to read anything else but the Bible. So knowledge was kept amongst the clergy of the Catholic Church, and clergy only. Anyone else found reading heretical texts, which would be the Quran, would be tortured, killed, or exiled. All right. So education was centered in monasteries. So by the 700s, most of the people in the Romano-Hispanic, all the Iberian Peninsula, had Spanish culture, Latin dialects, practicing Christianity, and living in a mix of Roman tradition and Germanic rulership. In short, pre-Islamic Iberia culture was a blend of indigenous tribal traditions, Roman urban legal and Christian culture, and Visigothic overlay of Germanic kingship. All right, that's good. All right. So now you got an idea of what these people are like. These, I'm going to try to wrap it up for you, summarize. The peasants, serfs, or however you want to look these folks, some of them were slaves, in the Iberian Peninsula were pretty much an oppressed people. They did not live happily for most of them. The Catholic Church, along with the Visigothic rulers, predetermined everything they had to do or could do. Taxes were a burden. They paid taxes on everything. The clergy could come into your home and pretty much do whatever they wanted. The social indexes indicate that the people were not very happy. They had no hygiene. They didn't have schools. Few practiced music. They had a polyglot of different languages. Unity was only formed under religious principle. With all of the invasions that they had incurred, we can wonder why these people might have been very much ready for a new rulership. Okay. So when we talk about the rulership, the authority, we have to talk about the authority of the bishops. What role did Catholic bishops play in pre-Islamic Spain? This is crucial to the invasion of the Moors and the maintaining of 800 years of Moorish rule. So with that said, I'll be back sometime later today, and we're going to start talking about the role that the bishops played in pre-Islamic Spain almost up to the Islamic invasion by the Moors.